In this video, I'll be making a two-part squish mold of a set of 6 sand dollars. To make the mold, I will have to set the sand dollars in clay, glue up a temporary box around them, and pour the first half of the silicone. Once cured, I'll flip it over and repeat the process to make the other half of the mold. I'll be showing every step of the process from beginning to end how I make this mold, as well as make some castings with the mold. So sit back and enjoy. I hope that this video doesn't out me as a counterfeiter. Well, here goes nothing. Today, I'm going to make a mold of these sand dollars. I picked them up at a local souvenir shop near where I live. I'll start building the mold box by figuring out how big the base needs to be. I'll do this by marking out how far back I want the sand dollars to be from the edge of the mold. Then I'll trace out the sand dollars onto this sheet of foam core board, making sure to have enough room between each sand dollar so that they won't interfere with one another. With everything laid out how I want it, I carefully cut out this piece for the base of the mold box. Then I cut out several long strips, which will make the sides of the mold box. I got the height for these by measuring how thick the sand dollars are and adding at least a ½ inch for above and below. Next, I need to set the sand dollars into some clay. The clay is just a placeholder that will allow me to define the shape of the two halves of the silicone mold. First, I need to roll out a flat sheet and place it on the foam board. This piece of clay will be the overall thickness that is needed for what will eventually be the top half of this mold. With the clay sheet set onto the foam board, I'm now ready to start setting the sand dollars into the clay. But before I get to that, I need to quickly remove a bit of extra clay from the edges of the foam board. That way, when I'm done, I can easily attach the side walls. To set the sand dollars onto the clay sheet, I rolled out a little sheet of clay, set the sand dollar on top of it, and cut out around it at an angle. Once I had my little sand dollar sized disc of clay, I placed it onto the larger clay sheet and blended them together with water. Placing the sand dollars on these raised areas, with the beveled edges, will make sure that the two halves of the mold will always line up with one another. Normally, I would make dimples in the clay as registration points. However, this way, the beveled edges act as the registration points, making sure that everything lines up perfectly. With the edge of the sand dollar being so thin, I was concerned that if I placed them on a flat plane as I usually do, the edges wouldn't align properly. This change to the way that I make a two-part mold will remedy that. With the first two set, I just continue the process with the remaining 4 sand dollars. Until I come across one that's more fragile than expected, and I completely shatter it into pieces. Unfortunately, I only bought the 6 regular sand dollars. However, fortunately, I did have something that I could put in its place, which allowed me to continue working on this project. When a problem arises, improvise. This big guy in the corner over here is what I had on hand to replace the one that broke. It was just barely able to fit into the spot that I had for it. With all of the sand dollars set into the clay, it's time to use the strips of foam board that I cut earlier to make the walls of the mold box. Using a hot glue gun, I glued them to the piece of foam board that makes the base. When gluing the vertical seams, I make sure to seal them up completely so that the silicone won't leak out. I only lightly glued the walls to the base so that it'll be easier to remove later. I don't have to worry about the seal around the bottom of the mold box because I pushed the clay up against the foam board to make a silicone tight seal. With the mold box fully built, I spray everything with a coat of release agent, so hopefully, things won't get stuck together too much. When pouring the silicone, I start by pouring a small layer over the mold subject and allowing gravity to pull it and stretch it out very thin. This pops many of the bubbles that are close to the mold subject, and I should end up with a relatively bubble-free mold. When I made this project, I initially did it as something that I call an overpour mold. This means that when I was working on a bigger mold, I could have something off to the side to pour any excess silicone that might be potentially left behind in the mixing bucket. This way, very little of my silicone would go to waste, and I can make progress on more than one project at a time. So that's the reason why I'm not mixing any silicone on camera for this project, because all of the silicone batches were mixed while I was working on something else. which is also why the following is going to be several small pours of silicone. So my apologies on that. I tried to keep the editing snappy if I could. With the first half of the silicone fully cured, it's time to open this thing up and prep the other side to pour the second half of the silicone. Normally, I'd leave the clay out to dry, which would make cleanup much easier. However, this one just kinda fell out, so cool. Moving on. Before pouring the second half, I first need to clean off any random bits of leftover clay or wayward bits of unneeded silicone. To do that, I'll use a toothbrush, this little pick, and a retractable knife. I did end up allowing that little piece of clay to dry out in the sun a bit before removing it. Each sand dollar had a little hole in it on the side. I'm not sure what part of the anatomy that is, and I'm not going to look it up, but I took a little piece of clay and filled in each one. Before pouring the silicone, I made sure to spray everything with a heavy coat of release agent. This way, I hopefully won't end up with an expensive block of silicone that has 6 sand dollars encased in it. For this batch, I ended up mixing up much more silicone than I needed for the other project, just so I could finish pouring the second half of this project in one go. Finally, demolding day. Time to crack this sucker open and see how it turned out. Well, I can say that I did not completely anticipate the silicone gripping the sand dollars and then getting shattered like that. No matter, I can peel it all off. Fortunately, the silicone isn't exactly stuck to the sand dollars, it's merely gripping into the porous surface. It was around this point that I got tired of scraping these things off with my fingers, so I decided to use resin to finish the cleanup. The idea was that the resin would lock all the little bits together and they'd peel out as one solid piece. So I mixed up some resin and poured it into the 2 spaces that still had sand dollar fragments in them. For the remaining spots, I mixed in some metallic powder to liven things up a bit. Since this mold is too big for my pressure chamber, I figured to try it out as the name Squish Mold implies, and squish the lid down with some weights. After a few hours, it's time to open the mold up and see how things turned out. Well, they look okay for the most part. At least my trick to clean up the sand dollar fragments seems to have worked the way that I wanted. I'm going to go over the results of these castings in the reveal at the end of the video, but for now, I have a little bit more work to do. Next, I'm going to use this scrap sheet of melamine to build a casing that will firmly hold the 2 halves of the silicone mold together. I start by taking measurements off of the silicone mold and then cutting out 2 equally sized pieces on my table saw. I also cut out a strip of melamine for the sides of the casing and cut it into 2 equal lengths. Now, it's just time to assemble everything. The box for this project is really simple compared to some of the others that I've made in the past. All I have to do is attach the sides to one of the larger rectangles that I made and drill some holes in the other. One note that I'd like to make is that I used a countersink drill bit to make sure that all the drill heads were below the surface of the melamine. To get the correct placement to drill holes in the lid for the pour spouts, I put the 3 pieces together and flipped it over, making sure that the silicone mold stayed in place. I then used a permanent marker to mark where all the openings were located. After drilling the pilot holes, I used a 1-inch Forstner bit in my drill press to make the holes large enough to be easy to use when pouring resin. I drilled the holes from either side of the melamine to make sure that they turned out nice and clean. Lastly, I just need to drill some pilot holes for the lid to attach to the rest of the case and it'll be ready to use. After quickly countersinking the holes in the lid, I'll assemble everything together and do another attempt at making some castings with this mold. For this round of castings, my goal was to make the sand dollars closer to the purple color that they are when they're alive. They only have the white color when they're dead. To do this, I used some chalk pigments to make the resin opaque and some alcohol inks for the actual purple color. Since I unintentionally made this mold too big for my original pressure chamber, I went ahead and picked up this chunky boy for when things get serious. The original one was only a 2.5 gallon. This one is a perfect 10. Alright, no air leaks. Now I can fill it up to the max pressure of 50 psi. After letting it sit overnight for the resin to cure, it's time to demold and see what I got. Well, for the most part, they seem to have turned out okay, with the exception of those two middle ones. I'll try one more go at it and see if I can get a better result. For this batch, I'm going to add some white chalk pigment to try to recreate the look of the original souvenir shop sand dollars. Again, no air leaks, so I'm good to go. And there they are. I ended up making several batches to try to figure out the issue with the air bubbles. I had some successes with that, but I also had a few failures. I tried a few different ways of pouring the resin into the mold to fix the issue. Eventually I had to drill some air outlets through the silicone so all the air could escape when in the pressure pot. Years ago, I was a producer of a medieval fantasy themed Renaissance festival style of an event, and we had an area of the event that was centered around mermaids. I had planned to make this mold back then so that I could have non-organic sand dollars that could be used around the water that the mermaids sat in, as well as could be somewhat safer to give to children. I ended up spraying a few with gold, silver, and copper spray paint. The idea being that they could be used as pretend money for an activity with the mermaids. All I know is that it's the only currency accepted for buying a sandcastle. And with that, I'll see y'all next time. Thanks for watching.